The rain was coming down in sheets. I stood at the end of a stranger's driveway. No car, no umbrella, no phone signal. In the middle of the night, soaking through every layer I was wearing. My suitcase sat beside me in a growing puddle. One of the wheels snapped off from being thrown down the front steps. My mascara was tracking down my face. My hands were shaking. Not from the cold, though it was cold, but from the kind of shock that only settles in when someone you trusted completely just proved they never deserved it. Behind me, the lights of my in-laws' house glowed warm and golden through the curtains. Inside, my husband was eating dinner. He hadn't come after me. I want you to stay with me for the next hour because what happened next, what really happened next, is the kind of thing that doesn't seem real when you're living it. And when I finally tell you who was in that motorcade, and why they stopped for me, and what they said to my husband's family, you will understand why I'm still not entirely sure that night wasn't a dream. But it wasn't a dream. And they are still, to this day, living with the consequences. My name is Elara Whitfield. Or at least that's the name I'm using here because some of the people in this story are still very much alive and very much powerful, and my lawyer, yes, I have a lawyer now, which tells you something about how things turned out, advised me to keep certain details vague. What I can tell you is that I grew up in a small town in the English countryside. The kind of town where everyone knows your name, your mother's name, and exactly which pew your grandmother sat in at church every Sunday morning for 40 years. My family wasn't wealthy. My father was a secondary school history teacher. My mother ran a small alterations and tailoring shop from the front room of our house. We were comfortable. We were kind. We were proud of what we'd built through quiet, honest work. I was the first in my family to go to university. I studied architecture. I was good at it, better than I let myself believe at the time, because modesty had been sewn into me like a second lining. I graduated with honors, moved to London, got a position at a respected mid-sized firm, and started building a life piece by careful piece. That's where I met Daniel. Daniel Cavendishmore. Even the name sounds like old money, doesn't it? That's because it is. The Cavendishmores are, a family of considerable standing. Not royalty, not aristocracy in the formal titled sense, but the kind of quietly influential family that has sat on charitable boards and county councils and trade associations for 6 generations. The kind of family that has a family portrait above the fireplace painted by someone whose name you would recognize. Daniel, to his credit, did not lead with any of this. When I met him at a colleague's dinner party, he was funny and self-deprecating and genuinely curious about my work. He asked good questions. He listened. He had warm eyes and a terrible habit of laughing at his own jokes just a half-second before the punchline landed. I fell in love with him in the ordinary, consuming, ridiculous way that people fall in love when they're 28 and haven't expected it. We dated for 2 years. He proposed on a quiet Tuesday evening in my flat. No grand gesture, no restaurant, just him on one knee in the kitchen while I was making pasta, holding a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. He said, "I don't want to wait for a dramatic moment. This is the moment. This is my life. Are you in?" I said yes. I said yes, and I meant it with everything I had. And if you're just finding this channel, don't go anywhere, because this story is far from over, and what happens in the second half is something I've never told completely before. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. What I did not fully understand when I said yes was that marrying Daniel meant marrying a set of expectations I had never been given a brochure for. The Cavendishmore family home was a manor house in Wiltshire. Not enormous by the standards of the truly grand estates. Only 12 bedrooms, only 40 acres, but formidable. The kind of house that has a name. The kind of house where you take your shoes off at the back door, and the front door is only open for guests of a certain social standing. His mother, Vivian, was the architecture of that house brought to life. Precise. Imposing. Immaculate in a way that suggested effortlessness, but clearly required enormous maintenance. She had the particular skill of looking you directly in the eyes while making you feel, somehow, like she was looking down. His father, Gerald, was warmer in appearance but more dangerous in practice. He smiled easily and said very little of consequence. What he communicated through Vivian. His sister, Charlotte, was 24 and had recently married a man from a family Vivian approved of, which seemed to be her primary qualification. Charlotte was not unkind to me. She was simply indifferent in the way that someone is indifferent to furniture they didn't choose and can't return. I knew from the first dinner I attended at that house The formal sit-down dinner with the candelabras and the 3 forks and the wine I was expected to identify from the smell alone, that Vivian did not think I was good enough for her son. She never said this directly. She was too skilled for that. What she did instead was a slow, methodical, multi-year campaign of small diminishments. The offhand comparisons to Daniel's previous girlfriend, who had been a barrister from a well-known family. The gentle questions about whether my firm was quite established yet, with just enough pause before established to let it do its work. The habit of consulting Daniel about decisions that directly affected both of us. Holidays, family events where we might eventually live. As though I were a pleasant accessory who didn't require input. Daniel, for his part, was caught. I want to be fair to him because fairness is something I've worked very hard to maintain in how I tell this story, and because the truth is more complicated than a villain. He was not cruel. He was not indifferent to me. He loved me, I believe, genuinely. But he had been raised inside that family's gravitational pull for 30 years, and when Vivian pulled, he moved toward her. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just slightly. Consistently. Like a compass needle that keeps drifting north, even when you try to point it somewhere else. The first 3 years of our marriage were lived in London, and they were good years. We had a flat in Bermondsey, a social life, independence. The family events were manageable because they were bounded. We arrived, we endured, we left. Then Daniel's father had a health scare. A cardiac episode. Not a heart attack as it turned out, but enough of a warning that the conversation about the future became urgent. Vivian called it consolidating the family. What it meant in practice was that Daniel and I were expected to move to Wiltshire to be closer to the family home. Daniel was expected to take a more active role in managing the family's property interests, and the small charitable foundation Gerald had run for decades. Daniel discussed this with me. I want to be clear about that. He did ask. But there was a shape to the conversation, a gentle but persistent lean, that communicated to me that the asking was a formality, that the answer had already been decided, that choosing otherwise would be a wound to the marriage that might not fully heal. I was 32. My career was at a turning point. I had just been shortlisted for a significant commission, a public arts center in Bristol. That would have been a genuine marker in my professional life. I turned down the commission. I moved to Wiltshire. I don't say this to establish myself as a martyr. I say it because you need to understand the weight of what I was carrying quietly in the years that followed. Because martyrdom requires an audience and I had none. I told no one how much that commission meant. I smiled and said it was the right decision for our family, and I genuinely tried to believe it. The house we moved into was a converted coach house on the edge of the family estate. It was beautiful technically. Stone walls, original beams, views across the fields. In a magazine it would have looked like a dream. What the magazine wouldn't have shown was that it sat 300 meters from the main house. Close enough that there was an expectation of proximity. Close enough that Vivian's car was frequently in our drive before I had finished my morning coffee. Close enough that the boundary between our home and their home was theoretical rather than real. Vivian had strong opinions about how the coach house should be decorated. She had stronger opinions about how our time should be spent. She had the strongest opinions of all about what Daniel's role in the family should be. And her vision of that role left limited space for me. I found work. I set up as an independent architectural consultant, working primarily with heritage property owners. There was no shortage of those in Wiltshire, and I built a small, respectable client base. It was quieter than London, less prestigious, but it was mine. Vivian's response to my work was a masterclass in the art of the unsaid. She would ask at dinners whether I had been keeping busy, with the tone of someone asking if the family dog had gotten enough exercise. She once referred to my clients in front of company as Elara's little projects. She never asked about my work with genuine curiosity. She asked in the way you ask about a hobby, and only to be polite. Daniel didn't correct her. He laughed sometimes when she was funny and I watched his laughter and I filed it. If you've ever felt invisible inside someone else's family, you know exactly what I'm describing. Drop a comment below, just the word "seen," if this is hitting close to home. 3.5 years into living on the estate, I became pregnant. This was genuinely, sincerely a joy. Whatever was complicated about my situation, the baby was not complicated. Daniel was thrilled. I was thrilled. For a few weeks, The weight of everything else lifted and I floated inside a simple happiness. Vivian's response to the news was interesting. She was pleased, I don't doubt that. She wanted grandchildren. But I noticed something in her response that I couldn't quite name at the time. A kind of proprietary delight. Less, I'm so happy for you both. And more, this is a wonderful development for the family. The pregnancy was difficult. I had hyperemesis in the first trimester, severe nausea and vomiting that kept me in bed for stretches of days. I lost weight. I was exhausted in a way that language isn't quite scaled to describe. During this period, Vivian's helpfulness increased dramatically. She brought meals. She organized things. She was present, constantly present in our home, and there was nothing I could say against it because it was all technically kind. But it came with a cost. The cost was information. Vivian began to know in granular detail how I was feeling, what I was eating, what my midwife had said, what my fears were. And she began to have opinions about all of it. Opinions delivered as concern, but concern that consistently implied that my instincts were incorrect and hers were superior. She felt I should rest more and work less. She felt I should not be taking on new clients at this stage. She felt the coach house was too cold and too isolated for a pregnant woman. This delivered with a meaningful look at Daniel, and she wondered aloud whether it might be better for everyone if we moved into the main house for the latter stages of the pregnancy. Daniel came to me with this suggestion 3 days later, as though he'd thought of it himself. I said no. It was the first time I'd said no to something that came from Vivian, clearly and without apology. The temperature in the family shifted after that. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would be visible to an outsider. But I felt it. Let me tell you about the night everything broke open. Our son was born in March. He was healthy and loud and perfect, and we named him Samuel, and the first time I held him I felt the kind of love that reorganizes your internal geography permanently. I recovered. I went back to work part-time when Samuel was 4 months old. Vivian's visits increased. Her opinions about Samuel's care were constant and unasked for. His feeding schedule, his sleep arrangement, which nursery he should eventually attend. Daniel's mother was raising Daniel's son in her mind, and I was a person she was being patient with in the meantime. The breaking point when it came was small, as breaking points usually are. It was a Sunday in October. Samuel was 14 months old. Daniel and I had been invited to a dinner in London, a professional event, an architecture prize ceremony where a colleague of mine was being recognized and had asked me specifically to attend. It was important to me. I had arranged, carefully, for a trusted babysitter who had looked after Samuel many times. Vivian found out about the dinner. She called Daniel and told him she felt it was inappropriate for us to leave Samuel with a sitter when the family was available. She offered herself and Gerald as alternatives. She framed this as a gift. Why would we pay someone when family was right there? Daniel came to me and suggested we take Vivian up on her offer. I said I had already confirmed with the sitter, and I was going to the dinner. The call Vivian placed to Daniel an hour later was a 40-minute conversation. I don't know everything that was said. What I know is that by the end of it, Daniel came downstairs and told me that his mother was hurt, that she felt we were being exclusionary, that she couldn't understand why I was resistant to family involvement in Samuel's life. We fought. A real fight, the kind that tears through the accumulated fabric of years rather than just the surface of the present argument. I said things I had been holding back for 3 years. He said things he had never said before, things about my coldness toward his family, about my inability to compromise, about how hard it was to be caught in the middle. I told him I had been compromising since the day I moved to Wiltshire. I told him about the commission in Bristol. I told him that being caught in the middle was a choice, that he kept choosing the middle because he was afraid of his mother's disapproval, and that what it looked like from where I stood was choosing her. He didn't respond to that. He went upstairs. I put Samuel to bed. I sat in the kitchen in the dark for a long time, and then I made a decision that probably seems in retrospect like a decision I shouldn't have made at 11 o'clock at night in an emotional state, but it was the truest decision I had made in years. I was going to the dinner. I called a car service. I packed a small overnight bag. I left a note on the kitchen table. I kissed Samuel's forehead very quietly so as not to wake him, and I drove to London. I need to pause here and ask you to stay with me because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, where does the motorcade come in? Promise you we are getting there. But the setup matters. The reason that Motorcade hitting you the way it does is because you understand what I've been carrying for 3 years. Stay with me. The dinner was wonderful. My colleague won the prize. There were speeches and champagne and the particular electric atmosphere of a room full of people who care deeply about buildings and light, and the way space makes people feel. I talked to people who asked real questions about my work. I laughed without monitoring whether the laugh was appropriate. I remembered for the first time in what felt like a very long time, who I was before Wiltshire. I stayed at a small hotel near the venue. I slept well. I came home the next afternoon. I should have sensed the temperature before I opened the door. The cars in the drive told a story: Gerald's Range Rover, Charlotte's car, a third vehicle I didn't immediately recognize. They were all inside, all waiting. What I walked into was not a conversation. It was a proceeding. Vivian sat at the head of our kitchen table, our table in our home, as though she had always occupied that position. Gerald sat beside her. Charlotte was on the sofa, studying her fingernails. Daniel stood by the window with his arms crossed and his eyes somewhere on the floor. Vivian told me, in precise and controlled language, that she was concerned. That my abandonment of my husband and child the night before had demonstrated a pattern of behavior that she found deeply troubling. That Daniel had spoken to her, and that the family had agreed that there needed to be a direct conversation about the future of my role in this household and in Samuel's life. My role. In my home. I want to describe what happened in my body in that moment. It was not anger at first. It was something colder. Something that moved up through my chest like water finding a crack in stone. A very clear, very quiet realization that I was standing in my own kitchen being put on trial, and that my husband was watching this happen from the window. I asked Daniel to ask his family to leave. He didn't. He said he thought we all needed to talk. Vivian said, and I am going to give you this one quote exactly because it is burned into my memory. Perhaps, Elara, the most honest thing we can all acknowledge today is that this has never quite been the right fit. The room was very quiet after that. Charlotte examined her nails. Gerald looked at the table. Daniel looked at the floor. I picked up the overnight bag I had set down when I walked in. I went to Samuel's room and I held him for a long time. I put him down. I went to our bedroom and I put more clothes in the bag. I came downstairs. Vivian asked where I was going. I told her I was leaving and that she had gotten exactly what she wanted. She told me that was being dramatic. I said the word documented. I said, every conversation has been documented. And I watched something shift in her eyes that I didn't fully understand yet. I walked out the front door. It had started raining. I want to tell you about standing at the end of that driveway because I don't want to skip past it. I stood there for a long time. The lane that led to the estate was dark, unlit, bordered by hedgerows. There was no signal on my phone. The car service I tried to book returned an error message. The rain was the determined British variety. Not dramatic, not stormy. Just relentless and cold and perfectly indifferent to your dignity. My suitcase had snapped off when Vivian, not Daniel, Vivian, had opened the front door behind me while I was still on the steps and said something sharp and final, and I had pulled the case away quickly and the wheel had caught on the edge of the step. I had not gone back for the wheel. I started walking. If you've ever had to walk away from something that was supposed to be your life, you know that it isn't really walking. It's more like trying to outpace the version of yourself that's still standing at the door. I walked for perhaps 15 minutes. The lane felt very long. I passed no other houses. There was nothing but the hedgerows and the rain and the sound of my suitcase dragging on the wet tarmac. And then I saw the lights. Here's what I thought it was first: a large vehicle. A lorry maybe. The kind of lights that fill a dark lane from side to side. I moved to the edge of the road, the very edge against the hedgerow, to let it pass. It did not pass. It slowed. And then it stopped. The vehicle was a black Jaguar Land Rover. Behind it, in the beam of its taillights, I could now see more vehicles. Many more. They stretched back along the lane in a precise, disciplined line. Black vehicles, all of them, and what I registered slowly through the rain was the detail that told me what I was looking at: the small flags on the front wings of the lead car. Royal household flags. The front passenger window came down. A woman looked out at me. She was perhaps 60, with an extremely composed face and a posture that somehow survived being in a car in the rain on a Wiltshire lane. She was wearing a dark coat with a small brooch. She said in a voice that was very calm and very clear, "Are you quite all right?" I was not quite all right. I said something to that effect. She said, "You're soaked through. Please get in." I said, because I am apparently a person who argues with royal motorcades, "I'm fine, thank you, I'm just." "You are standing in a country lane in a rainstorm dragging a suitcase with a broken wheel," she said. "You are not fine. Please get in the car." I got in the car. The interior was quiet in the way that extremely expensive things are quiet, not silent but insulated. There was a faint smell of leather and something floral. The seats were the kind of warm that seems actively generous. The woman who had spoken to me, I learned her name later. I won't use it here, but she holds a position in the royal household that you would recognize instantly, passed me a folded towel from somewhere and said nothing while I dried my face and my hands. In the seat beside her was a woman in her early 70s. I knew her face. Everyone in England knows her face. I am not going to tell you her name or her title. I am going to tell you that she is one of the most photographed people in the history of this country, and that on a wet Tuesday evening in October, she was in the back of a car on a private lane that runs adjacent to the Cavendish Moor estate because that lane, which appears to be private, is actually a designated route for certain official movements that the public is not generally aware of. She looked at me with the focused, specific attention of someone who has spent 70 years paying attention to people. She said, "What's happened?" And I told her. I told her in the way you tell someone when you are wet through and exhausted and the careful architecture of your composure has been disassembled by a broken suitcase wheel in a country lane. Which is to say, I told her everything in no particular order, without any of the editing I would normally apply. I told her about London and the commission I didn't take. About Wiltshire and the coach house in 300 meters. About Vivian's table in my kitchen and the phrase, "Never quite been the right fit." About Daniel at the window. She listened with complete attention. She did not say how terrible, or how dreadful, in the way that people do when they are waiting for you to finish. She listened the way someone listens when they are going to do something with the information. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You mentioned the Cavendish Moor name." I said yes. She said, "I know Gerald Cavendish Moor. His family's foundation has intersected with several charitable interests I oversee. He was on a committee of mine some years ago." I didn't say anything. She said, "He presented himself as a man of considerable decency." I said, "I think he believes he is one." She looked at me for a long moment. Then something moved across her face that was not quite a smile but was in the family of smiles. She said, "We are going to take you somewhere warm and dry, and someone is going to bring you tea, and then we will see about the rest." The rest. I held those two words for the entire 40-minute drive. We ended up at a property I won't name specifically, but which was approximately 12 miles from the Cavendish Moor estate and which, when the gates opened, made very clear the magnitude of the world I had fallen into. I was brought inside by a member of staff. I was given dry clothes, practical things, nothing theatrical, the kind of things that are simply available in houses where guests sometimes arrive unexpectedly. I was given tea. I was given a room. No one asked me any questions. No one treated me as anything other than a person who needed warmth and rest. I want to be very clear about something. Nothing about what happened next was theatrical. There were no proclamations. No one swept in and announced that justice would be served. It was much quieter than that and much more effective. I slept. In the morning there was a knock on the door. The woman who had spoken to me from the car, I'll call her Margaret because that's not her name, came in with a cup of tea and sat down. She told me that certain inquiries had been made. She told me that a family solicitor had been put in contact with the household's legal counsel. She told me that the nature of my departure from the family home, specifically the presence of witnesses, the circumstances, and certain things I had said about documentation when I left, had been noted and were being considered carefully. I had, she explained, certain rights as a spouse that Vivian Cavendish Moor appeared to have overlooked entirely in her management of the previous evening's proceedings. I asked Margaret what I should do. She said, "You should go back. Not because you owe them anything, but because your son is there." She paused. "And because walking back in is significantly more powerful than walking out was." I was driven back to the estate the following afternoon. Not in the way I had left, on foot in the rain with a broken suitcase wheel. I was driven back in a car from the household. A black car properly appointed. I sat in the back and watched the familiar hedgerows pass the window, and I felt, for the first time in 3 years, as though I had the correct posture for this conversation. The car pulled up to the front of the Cavendishmore Manor house, not the coach house, the main house, and the driver opened the door. Vivian appeared in the doorway. I watched her look at the car. I watched her look at the crest on the door. I watched her look at me. I had thought during the drive about what I was going to say. I had drafted small speeches in my head, satisfying things full of the things I should have said years ago. By the time I stepped out of that car, every draft was gone. What I had instead was something much simpler. I walked up the steps. I looked at Vivian Cavendishmore. And I said, I'm going to get my son now. And then I'd like to speak to Daniel. Alone. She stepped aside. I need you to understand what that moment cost her. Because she stepped aside is 4 words, but in the language of Vivian Cavendishmore, stepping aside for the daughter-in-law she had spent 3 years systematically diminishing, stepping aside after seeing whose car she had arrived in, was a seismic event. For words. An entire geology. Daniel was in the study. He looked, when I came in, like a man who had spent the night being quietly informed of things he hadn't expected. His face had the particular expression of someone revising a very fundamental set of assumptions. I closed the door. I sat down across from him. I said, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. Not as a threat. As information. I told him that I had documentation, 3 years of it, careful and systematic, because I had understood for a long time that I might eventually need it. Texts, emails, recorded voicemails, a diary with dates and details. A record of the pattern that any family court would find very legible. I told him that I was not interested in destroying him or his family. I was interested in my son and in a life that I could recognize as mine. I told him that I wanted us to try, properly try with a therapist who had no connection to his family, in a setting that was not Wiltshire, to see whether the marriage was salvageable. I told him that if it wasn't, I would be leaving, and that I would be leaving with Samuel, and with the legal support of people who made Vivian's solicitor look like a student project. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I didn't come after you. I said, no. He said, I should have come after you. I said, yes. He said, my mother. I said, your mother is not in this room. Another long silence. He said, what do I have to do? Here is what happened in the weeks and months after that, and I want to give it to you without drama because the undramatic version is actually the more powerful one. Vivian received a letter. I don't know everything in the letter. I know it came from a solicitor whose firm, let's say, has an address you would find in Debrett's. I know it referenced certain specific incidents. I know it made very clear that the legal standing of Elara Whitfield Cavendish as a spouse, mother, and professional had been noted by certain interested parties and would be treated accordingly. I know this because Vivian came to the coach house 3 days after I returned. She knocked on the door. She had not knocked on my door in 3 years. I opened it. She stood there in her immaculate coat, and there was something in her face that I had never seen before. Not remorse exactly, but the expression of a woman recalculating. A woman who has always played a game very confidently, and has just been shown that someone else knows the rules and has a better hand. She asked if she could come in. I said she could. She sat down. She said, and I will give you this one also because it was extraordinary in its precision. I understand there are things I may have managed poorly. May have managed poorly. I did not smile. I did not say you think. I did not do anything satisfying in that moment because what I had learned in the past week was that satisfaction without strategy is just noise. I said, yes, there are. She said, what would you like from me? I told her. I told her clearly, simply, and completely. I told her what boundaries looked like. I told her what respect looked like. I told her what Daniel's marriage to me needed to look like if it was going to survive. I told her that my work was not a hobby and Samuel was not a Cavendishmore project and the coach house was my home, and she was welcome in it when she was invited. She listened. She said, that seems reasonable. 3 words from Vivian Cavendishmore. Possibly the most expensive 3 words she had ever spoken. If you're watching this and thinking, wait, that's it? That's the ending? Stay. Because I have 2 more things to tell you. Daniel and I went to therapy. Not at his family's suggestion. Not mediated by anyone connected to the Cavendishmore estate. Twice a week for 8 months, in an office in Bath with a therapist named Dr. Osei who had no idea who Daniel's family was and zero interest in finding out. It was the most honest 8 months of our marriage. I learned things about Daniel that I hadn't known, not because he'd hidden them, but because neither of us had created enough space for them to surface. I learned that he had spent his entire childhood performing a version of himself that Vivian could approve of, and that when she disappeared from view he genuinely didn't know who he was. I learned that his failure to come after me that night had cost him something permanent in his own estimation of himself, and that living with that was its own discipline. He learned things about me that I had kept too quiet. He learned what Bristol had meant. He learned what standing in that kitchen being told I was never quite the right fit had done to something in me that I hadn't known was there to be damaged. We did not arrive at a perfect marriage. Perfection isn't a destination. It's a direction. We arrived at something real. We're still married. Samuel is 4 now, and genuinely insufferable in the best way. The kind of child who argues philosophical positions at breakfast and cries with his whole body when he's sad and has absolutely no idea how observed and loved he is. Vivian is in his life. Not on her terms anymore. On terms that we agreed to. She comes on Sundays when she's invited. She has learned, at the age of 67, the extraordinary and difficult art of knocking. Gerald, to my surprise, became slowly, tentatively, in the understated way of Englishmen of a certain generation, something close to an advocate. He told Daniel once something that Daniel relayed to me. She's tougher than she looks, your wife. Don't lose her. I don't know what prompted it. I don't need to know. Now, the second thing I promised you. I told you I said the word documented as I was leaving. And I told you I watched something shift in Vivian's eyes. Here's what she didn't know. I had been keeping that record for nearly 2 years by that point. Every diminishing comment. Every decision made over my head. Every little project. The voicemail where she told Daniel that she worried I was not stable enough for the realities of family life. The email where she suggested to Charlotte that perhaps Daniel had settled. I had it all. I had it because a therapist I'd seen briefly in London 2 years before the explosion, a therapist I'd seen for 6 sessions to talk about the anxiety I'd developed living on the estate, had said something to me that I didn't fully understand at the time. She'd said, "When we feel unseen, we often stop recording. The best thing you can do is start keeping a record. Not for a tribunal, not for revenge, but for yourself. So that you stop doubting your own experience." I started keeping the record. It turned out in the end to be for both. The documentation was shared carefully legally through the appropriate counsel, with the board of the charitable foundation Gerald had run and Daniel now managed. The foundation had certain governance standards. Certain conduct requirements for family members acting as representatives. Several of Vivian's communications, the ones that touched on professional matters on my standing, on conversations she'd had with third parties about Daniel's wife, fell short of those standards. She was asked to step back from her informal advisory role at the foundation. She was not removed publicly. There was no scandal. There were no headlines. There was simply a very quiet, very firm redistribution of who had power and who understood where the edges were. Vivian Cavendishmore, at 67, was for the first time in her adult life operating without the leverage she had always assumed was permanent. That is the sound of a door closing that can't be opened from the outside. I want to end by saying something to anyone watching this who is in the early or middle part of a story like mine, because I know you're out there. I know some of you are in that coach house right now, metaphorically speaking. 300 meters from a house where someone else is running the game. Here is what I want you to know. The documentation is real. Start it. Not out of bitterness. Not even out of strategy. Start it because you deserve to know that your experience is real. Because the slowest and most corrosive damage is the damage done to your sense of your own perception. The allies are real. They appear in the strangest places. In country lanes, in the rain, in the back of a car going somewhere you didn't expect. They appear when you are standing up straight even when it costs you something. They appear when you have been the person who does the work quietly and without audience. And the ending, the real ending, not the dramatic confrontation you imagine in the middle of the night, is not the speech. It's not the moment Vivian stepped aside. It's the Sunday afternoon in November when I was sitting in the garden with Samuel and Daniel came outside with 2 cups of tea. And we just sat there for a long time, watching our son run in circles, and I thought, this is mine. All of this. Mine. Not because I fought for it dramatically, or because a motorcade intervened, or because a powerful woman in a dark coat asked me to get out of the rain. Because I stayed. Because I documented. Because when the moment came, I knew exactly what I deserved and I was able to say it out loud without apology. Because I was the architect. I had always been the architect. I had just been building in someone else's plans for too long. If this story reached you, if some part of it landed somewhere true, please leave a comment. I read every one of them. Tell me your version of the country lane moment. Tell me what you walked away from or what you walked back into. Tell me what you're building. Like this video if you stayed to the end. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. And if you know someone who is in the middle of their own Wiltshire, share this with them. Sometimes all a person needs is to hear, get in the car. You don't have to stand in the rain. I'll see you in the next one.